One of the things I hear quite often from Marxists is that capitalism can't exist without the state. And I agree insofar that the state is defined as some institution that is able to secure private property rights, but I want to talk today about a different way in which I think capitalism, as in present corporatist capitalism of the sort that we know, can't exist without the state. And that's with reference to the Coasian idea of transaction costs. So the brief version of the standard theory is that one of the reasons why firms exist, aside from the whole time preference thing and the Bohm-Bavekian theory of capital, is it reduces transaction costs. So why is there a little bit of like socialism and a little bit of central planning within firms? It's because if I was a worker in a pencil factory and I wanted to pay the capitalist every single time I used a particular machine, so that we could have a more direct link between my use of the machine and him getting paid, then we'd start racking up a lot of costs. That would be, really, really time consuming. It would be wasteful. It would be pointless and wasteful. So, this is why we have firms. This is why we have a central planning type system where you have a contract in advance that says I'm going to get to use this machine as much as I please during the next year in order to make these pencils, but in return you're going to get a certain amount of profit skimmed off the top of the pencils that I contribute to producing. So what's my idea about the state then? Well, I think that intrinsic to the idea of a state is taxation. Now, okay, but the definition of a state is both fought over and controversial and so on. But I think presently existing states, at least, tend to have taxes, and they tend to be financed by not exclusively consumption tax and not exclusively taxes on company profits. It is conceivable that a state can exist that is exclusively funded by consumption tax, but for the purposes of my argument, I'm going to work with states that have things like income taxes, that have some kind of regard for what employment is. This is the point. In order for a state to tax some things, it needs to know what employment is. So in order for it to tax my income as a worker, it needs to know how much I'm getting paid. In order to know even how much they should tax a company in some situations, they need to know how many employees they have. In order to have regulation of any kind for companies, quite often they need to know what employment is. So employment becomes a defined thing. It becomes something that the state has implicitly decided by the fact that it is taxing the employed. Why is this relevant? Well, suppose that it really was efficient in some industries for me to suppose, as a pencil factory worker, actually pay the capitalist every time I use the pencil machine. Okay, so what if, for example, I am as my mother is, I'm a worker at a university, and it's not on my job description to carry things from one department to another, but once in a while I have to do it. And it would be better if I had to be paid every time I did it. Each individual time I was asked to do something that was not on my job description, it'd be good if I was paid for that, specifically. as a separate thing from my usual job. My mother is a first aider, for example. Every time she needs to perform first aid, maybe she should get paid a little bit extra, or something, right? This is a thing for firms to decide. So suppose that there is at least some industry in which it would be more efficient to have a less defined employment contract, for people to deviate from the traditional employment contract style, which says, you know, you're going to get paid weekly or monthly, the contract's going to be renewed after this and that period, you have this set of jobs to do, you're going to do this one this often, you're going to do that one that often, and so on. This whole paradigm that, well, a bit of weird lighting, this whole idea that employment contracts need to look like that is basically constructed by the state. Now, it's not a deliberate thing, obviously, but it's necessary. So, given that there is a state, and given that it does tax incomes, it becomes much more difficult for me to propose to my employer that we have a special employment contract. That, for example, I will have a very flexible work week. Obviously, you can have people with flexible work weeks and so on, but suppose that they have a job vacancy. Like the whole idea of a job vacancy, first of all, is only made possible by this kind of really rigid system. Suppose that they have a job vacancy for analyst at a bank, and I apply, but I don't want to be an analyst at the bank and work full-time, or even part-time. I want to be an analyst at the bank and work every second week, right? Now, that might not be convenient necessarily, but suppose that there are some industries in which that is a good idea, that people have that opportunity. There are industries that offer that kind of contract as standard because it's necessary for that industry. So you get week on week off stuff for like people that work on oil rigs and things. That's not the point that I'm trying to get to. What if an individual worker wants to deviate from the original, like, ordinary style of employment contract? It's still worth it to the employer. The employer might even say, okay, but we're going to pay you less than an ordinary worker because of this whole, like, we're going to have to keep tabs on you, we're going to need to, you know, keep track of where you are, what you're doing, you're going to be special, it's going to cost us money, but in theory you can do it if you're willing to get paid less. It's then worth it for both parties if they agree. But these kind of really unorthodox ways of operating become much more difficult when the state is involved, and it requires that, effectively, people have a certain standard kind of employment contract, because otherwise it becomes really complicated and difficult to tax. The state has effectively created the modern form. No, sorry, I'm busy right now. The state has effectively created the modern form of both the employment contract and the corporation as a whole. So, both through this mechanism and through then regulating what came out of this mechanism, the state has pretty much standardized the firm, which is, when you look at various industries, very, very similar. Generally speaking, you've only got a few kinds of firm over the various industries where you might expect that firms would look very different in the pencil industry to the car manufacturing industry, or whatever, right? So, it seems to me that this is another way in which the state has warped and changed what it means to be employed in a private contract without even, like, deliberately doing so. They can be a relatively laissez-faire type state. They can say, you know, we're not going to regulate you and so on. We're just gonna have, say, progressive income taxation, and we're just going to fund the entire state through that, but we're going to leave you alone, pretty much. Well, you're not leaving them alone. You're making them into a certain kind of corporation by the very fact that you are funding any kind of state activity through that mechanism. So this has made companies both more inefficient and encourage the exploitation of workers, because workers are then unable to get the kind of contracts that they want, and less of a role is given to, less attention is paid to the various ways in which a worker has compensating differentials for their lower or higher wages. So again, like, suppose that somebody's getting paid £10 an hour, or $10 an hour, excuse me, I'm mainly talking to Americans probably, $10 an hour for a particular job, and I'm willing to only get paid $9 an hour for doing exactly the same job, provided that I'm given better safety equipment. Now, theoretically, I can go off and buy my own safety equipment, but suppose that I want it for some reason bought through the firm. Maybe the firm can get discounts on it. Who knows, right? Suppose that I would prefer to have that kind of unorthodox style of employment contract. And suppose that I'm female. The state won't let me do that, because then it would be unequal pay for equal work, right? So this is a way in which the state has made something, well, not deliberately, made something very standard that should be very fluid, that should be very flexible. I believe that there are, like, almost certainly many industries in which an unorthodox employment contract would be superior. Personally, I'm kind of looking into potentially getting into consulting with my limited but growing knowledge of economics, and I feel already, as I'm thinking about entering the job market in a few years' time, obviously as a graduate, I'm already starting to think about, wouldn't it be cool if I could go to the CEO of a big firm? Again, big firms generally shouldn't really exist because of ideal firm size, and it's only really through state intervention that they're able to get so big. But you know, theoretically, wouldn't it be cool if I could go to somebody high up, which I presently can't, and say, okay, yeah, I have different preferences to most workers, I'm willing to pay for less, or, excuse me, I'm willing to work for less, if you give me these special privileges, if you work with me in a different way. Or, alternatively, I am willing to use fewer resources than other workers. I'm willing to bring my own stationery. Suppose that my father is the owner of a stationery company, I'll bring my own stationery to the consulting firm, and in return they'll pay me more, because I'm not using as many resources as the other workers are. So, conclusion, I think that Marxists are right. Capitalism, in the form that we see it today, can't exist without the state. Capitalism and markets and so on would look radically different if there was no state, because the very fact that the state exists and needs to be financed, and I suppose the not logically necessary fact that doesn't really stem from that, that is the vast majority of states are not paid for through consumption taxes exclusively, means that the very nature of what we usually consider the private voluntary sector has been fundamentally warped.